and why you should not run away from it. You should understand it. There's a lot of maybe FOD in this ecosystem, and that's why the Postgres room yesterday was also fairly crowded. I think it's worth noting that we have a very good, diverse community. I work at Percona. We make 100% open source tools, and before that, I did MariaDB Server and MySQL. So most importantly, I think MySQL is nearly 23 years old. It's basically past being a voting adult. Percona Server is also about 9 years old. MariaDB, 8 years old. It was probably worth mentioning Drizzle, which we can learn some stuff about. How many of you heard of or used Drizzle before? Heard of, okay. Okay, how many of you heard of or used WebScale SQL before? Okay, significantly a lot more. So, you know, you kind of learn in these experiments that companies need different things. And WebScale SQL actually posted a very good sort of goodbye message in December of 2016. And they still meet up every year at the Percona Live. And actually, a lot of the features in WebScale SQL probably also made its way into MariaDB Server as well as Percona Server, and some even directly into MySQL itself. And we don't have much learnings from Drizzle, besides the whole don't have all the core developers hired by a single company argument. So at some stage, we will learn more about that. Also, a shout out to MariaDB, who just celebrated its 8th birthday. February 1st was the GA release, so kudos, Monty. This cake is not obviously mine. It's Lixin Ping's cake. I stole it from his LinkedIn profile. He works at Alibaba and on MariaDB as well. He's not here, but he is at FOSDEM. So, Daniel Van Eden is also not here, sick. He actually created this, and I ended up modifying it to give you sort of an idea of where we are in terms of a branch. And I know it's really small, so this one should be better. Not by much, maybe. How do I do that? It's fine. You don't need to see. You don't need to see me. That. So oh no, you don't want that. You switch it off. Oh, okay. Anyway, very nice graph. It's generated. Daniel started this project like 5 years ago. It was based on something else on relational databases. And it's very worth noting that in MySQL 5.5, which is what started lots of things, you'll realize that that's when InnoDB scalability was focused on. And I think we have a talk later about performance from Dimitri, who's here somewhere. And 5.6 also brought along a lot of optimizer improvements, and in fact, MariaDB 5.3 also did that as well. Percona Server 5.5 brought in group commit and the binary log, which was ported from MariaDB Server. But then after that, Percona uses the regular 5.6 implementation. MariaDB Server 10.2 actually gets some things from MySQL 5.7, which is InnoDB. Yes, Monty. Yes, that was in the previous slide. I didn't want to focus on that. It's very hard to see. Very hard to see from afar. So anyway, this graphic is available at Daniel Van Eden's GitHub repository, and the pull request for the modified version, which now includes the GAF cluster, MariaDB 10.2 pulling InnoDB. So this line here means it's pulling InnoDB as opposed to pulling ExtraDB. And obviously, we're both waiting for 8.0 and 10.3 to come out. So 8.0.4 is in the second release candidate. So my presumption is we'll see a generally available release soon. And MariaDB Server 10.3.4 is in a second beta. So I guess soon we'll see a release candidate as well. But this is a general idea of where the branches and forks and community has spread, really. And of course, just to annoy Mark a little bit, there is also bits about Drizzle there. So in terms of the open source community, I think MariaDB is excellent, taking external contributors as well as committers, so you can actually commit code directly to the MariaDB tree. Also participates in Google Summer of Code, which helps get younger blood into server development. MySQL 5.7 has taken patches as well, say virtual columns from MariaDB from the same guy called Andrei Zhakov, which became generated columns but was also heavily rewritten. And MySQL also takes lots of contributions from Percona. So actually, if you look at, and even Facebook and so forth, so if you look at the release notes, you'll find that there are all these companies that are credited. And those tend to be like 70 pages long if you look at the PDF of where the credits come from. And it's actually quite a long list from MySQL. Contributions are obviously welcome, but you can't commit directly to the code base, which is something that's probably more or less always been true. There's also a MySQL Community Contributor Award program that Oracle runs, and actually the two people probably running that are sitting right here in the front, and they're also running this room. So kudos. For Percona, it's similar. You can report bugs, you can ask for features, but you can't commit to the tree either, even though it's all on GitHub. Also, these things called contributor agreements that are probably worth noting. Oracle requires you to sign an Oracle contributor agreement. I understand some corporates have issues signing that. MariaDB also has a contributor agreement or the option of contributing with BSD new, such that you don't have to sign a contributor agreement, and that maybe makes things easier for people. But also, when it comes to contributed code, code is not just something you drop and then you run away. Code is something that requires maintenance actively, and what is the state of the community maintained code is also really important to look at. People ask, is MySQL dying? So I stood out at the Percona booth yesterday, and lots of people were like, MySQL is dying. Oh, we don't want to use MySQL because Oracle owns it. Those are not technical reasons why you should not use MySQL. And MySQL is far from dying. It's clearly exaggerated. We're getting better MySQL all the time. Every time there's a new release, it gets better. There are a lot of external contributors. I think pretty much everyone in this audience is an external contributor of some sort. There's lots of people using it. There's tons of shared knowledge. I mean, look at the amount of shared knowledge on making InnoDB work well. It's amazing. And Oracle has been actually a great steward because they've not actually killed MySQL development. They've just enhanced MySQL development, which you can see in 5.6, 5.7, 8.0 even. Like the release candidate is actually worth using. In fact, there's this website called The Complete List of Features run by a guy called Morgan Taka, who used to work on MySQL as well. And this just lists features in 5.7 that are highlights. And I think there are more than 150 features that are highlighted on that list. The documentation is now so complex for MySQL that I think if you print out the PDFs, you might actually hit some 4,000 pages. And a couple of months ago, I think Giuseppe, Fred, and I, we were having a chat with someone who wanted to know more about grants. And actually, if you look at the documentation for grants, it's actually fairly complex without having years of experience dealing with grants. It may not be super easy for a newbie to pick up on it. As such, they do grant all, asterisk dot asterisk, which is not what they're supposed to be doing. So actually, there's a lot of new features that a lot of people don't know exists and maybe don't use yet, and it's kind of sad because it's been out for more than 2 years. So one of my favorite ones is online buffer pool resize, and how everything starts becoming more online as we are able to grow things nowadays. And of course, things like multi-source replication, even though it came to MariaDB first, it is also present in 5.7. I personally also like the JSON MySQL shell and the XDev API and the X protocol because I think it's super cool. Lots of people nowadays like to do stuff with MongoDB, and this sort of gives you an insight from that standpoint. Also, GIS functionality. I spoke to people yesterday as well saying, hey, we're using Postgres. We used to use MySQL, but then we use Postgres now because of GIS. But the GIS functionality in MySQL 5.7 is actually heavily underrated, right? It's not only is it good, it can also do stuff like Google Maps can do. And I think Norvald, who may or may not be here, has also given a great talk at the GIS track about GIS in MySQL. So there are lots of things that people don't really know about, which is unfortunate. And that's also true for MariaDB. So 10.1 brought a whole bunch of new things. Start transaction with consistent snapshot, to be fair, is now also in MySQL 5.7. Galera cluster being integrated, very cool. The first to introduce table space encryption. InnoDB defragmentation, parallel replication, we'll probably have a talk about that as well later. The thread pool is highly useful from being open source as well. And roles, SQL standard roles, which Giuseppe will talk about later as well. Not the MariaDB variant, but the MySQL variant. 10.2 also brought other features like InnoDB as the default InnoDB. Now that may be a play on words, because nowadays when you ask for something, you get something else. So for a long time, if you ask for InnoDB, you got ExtraDB. And in many Linux distributions, if you ask for MySQL, you get MariaDB. So Myrox is in alpha. There are obviously window functions and common table expressions, two things that are probably very useful. I like this a lot, the AWS key management plugin. Highly useful if you're going to use encryption because you don't want to use the file key management plugin. And of course, Oracle style execute immediate, where you start seeing new stuff. And this is obviously not, these are not comprehensive lists of what's new. It's just stuff that's worth noting that you may not necessarily see in another distribution of MySQL. Percona Server for 5.6 and 5.7 also introduces other things. Percona Server mostly focuses on wanting to be more manageable, more usable, more operationally useful. So things like the utility user, if you're running in like say OpenStack, for example, you may find use for something like the utility user where you have system access, but you can't actually look at the schema. And the proxy protocol support, if you want to use maybe HA proxy, which supports the proxy protocol, backup locks, improvements around backups and extra backup. Then, of course, since we're going to talk about the ecosystem, the server ecosystem anyway, here's a base blog post. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's worth reading. Compatibility largely means that things are supposed to exist or occur together without problems or conflict. And this is true even in computing. Why it really matters is because if people ask for a feature in one server, they may not get it in the next server because they're not necessarily drop-in compatible. And MariaDB server is, after all, the default in pretty much every Linux distribution except Ubuntu. The latest Ubuntu does ship 5.7. I think it's worth noting from a Linux distribution or a more pragmatic standpoint, we should take a page out of the cloud operators. The cloud operators don't pass off MariaDB as MySQL or vice versa. That is true for Amazon, that is true for Microsoft, that is true for Rackspace. They actually offer you multiple choices. And choice is actually probably a good thing because you realize very quickly, like, hey, maybe I want to use InnoDB memcached for put-get, and that's not present, say, in some server. So Monty did ask a question earlier, and he is in the audience. So he did make a verbal commitment a while ago about MySQL 5.6 should be comparable to MariaDB Server 10.1 as well as 10.2 comparable to 5.7. And till today, you actually get the description that it's an enhanced drop-in replacement for MySQL. And this is true because the data directory is the same, the port is the same. But in terms of feature compatibility, it may not necessarily be equivalent. Governance is obviously worth talking about. MariaDB has a corporation as well as a foundation, and I think that's really important that the foundation gets stronger. And today, you'll notice the foundation has foundation members from Booking.com, Visma, Alibaba Cloud, IBM, WordPress.com, Microsoft, and even Tencent. So diverse representation in a foundation is a good thing. MySQL, for better or for worse, is actually governed by Oracle. And as I said, people have negative connotations to a company that actually does good things. And Percona is governed by a corporation called Percona Inc. It's also privately held and has never raised any funding before, and has been around for like 11 years without funding. So you gotta know who's funding what. And if you ask, is there vendor lock-in in open source? That's something to also always think about overall, and that's a bigger FOSDEM thing. So in terms of releases, here are a bunch of releases. You'll notice that 10.1 and 5.7 were released basically 2 days apart, and as I said, 10.3.4 is in beta. beta 2 now, and MySQL 8.04 is in release candidate 2 now. So I'd suggest if you are interested, you should start looking at this stuff because, you know, if I'm a guessing person, you're going to see these generally available in like 3 months, give or take. And Percona Server, I don't list it here because it generally follows from a major release anywhere between 3 to 6 months behind. And for example, a good example is MySQL 8.3 is already being worked on by the developers. Replication is important, and this I took straight out of the MariaDB knowledge base. It is definitely easier to migrate to MariaDB server, but it's harder to migrate away from MariaDB server in terms of from a replication standpoint. So I don't want to throw any Hotel California jokes here. There are obviously things that are different. So the default bin log format in 10.2 is mixed as opposed to being row in MySQL. The annotation of row events is on. Time-delayed replication is available in MariaDB 10.2 as well. This, I think, is an extremely unique feature, DML-only flashback, which allows you to roll back instances to an older snapshot. Synchronous replication. Lots of people are very interested in things like Galera cluster, and Galera cluster has spawned 2 branches, so to speak. One's called MariaDB Galera cluster, which is built into MariaDB server. And of course, there's Percona XDB cluster with proxy SQL and an admin tool. And synchronous replication is probably going to play an even more important role going forward. And Oracle has come up with something possibly similar. It's called group replication, and it's very tied with MySQL SH. It's also very tied to MySQL router, and the product around it is called MySQL InnoDB cluster, which one could actually launch. And Fred has a nice little video, I think, on YouTube. Maybe it takes you 5 minutes to watch the video, and you could actually start your own little InnoDB cluster and listen to his soothing voice. So let's talk about the X protocol. MariaDB server does not have that at the moment. So you can't use MySQL SH, and this consequently means you will not be starting up an InnoDB cluster. So this definitely means, from a synchronous replication standpoint, things are diverging. Encryption. MySQL 5.7 and MariaDB Server 10.1 and greater both have encryption. The MariaDB version does tablespace as well as table encryption based on the Google patch, and MySQL only does tablespace encryption. You are required to use InnoDB file per table for MySQL, but this has been the default for quite some time now. And as logs don't get encrypted in the MySQL variant today, but they are in the MariaDB variant. So MySQL bin log obviously has a bit of an issue in MariaDB, but you can do read from remote server and use the encryption plugin API as well as a plugin, but it obviously adds some load to the server. I actually mentioned that it doesn't encrypt tables or logs. Yeah. Yeah. We'll do questions later. Security. MySQL native password, which has been around since 4.1, I think, but renamed later, uses double SHA-1 based authentication, and I guess that's not useful any longer. So MySQL has this thing called SHA-256 password since MySQL 5.6. You are more than encouraged to probably turn this on going forward. In fact, there are some good blog posts just last week about SHA-256 as well as MySQL 8. So beware. MariaDB follows this thing called ED25519, which is the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm used by OpenSSH. This is another implementation. Naturally, they're both obviously not compatible, so probably worth noting that if you're creating users and migrating from one server to the other, you have to reset the passwords. Validated password is on by default in MySQL 5.7, so if you by default provide a poor password, it will actually tell you not to do that. And SSL also has various differences. So SSL in 5.7 is pre-generated keys, and you just need to turn it on in the client. And there's also a utility called MySQL SSL RSA setup that's provided with MySQL 5.7 that you can use. Libraries are changing. So YASL, I guess changes name every few years to Yazzle, Shiazzle, Wolf SSL. Um, anyhow, ignore the name changes. It's all going OpenSSL going forward. There are also user table changes. So if you write scripts, oh dear. If you write scripts, it's worth noting that you need to actually make note of the fact that there are changes in the MySQL user table. Password expiry does not exist yet from last I checked. Password last change as well as lifetime is available in MySQL. Account locks and unlocks also probably important. Slides will be online, so I provide lots of links. Stuff that might matter to you. MySQL has had optimizer hints, query rewriting, optimizer trace, which could be very useful. I think at one stage someone from Wikipedia, Hamey, wanted it, and he's speaking here later. I don't know if he's here later now. MySQL super read-only mode. He's here. MySQL super read-only mode, very important when you're doing automatic failovers to ensure that super user doesn't accidentally write. Also something we're looking forward to. And a newer performance schema. When it comes to tools, if a tool requires the MySQL Global Transaction ID, so MySQL failover, replication admin, MHA for GTID-based failover, which Yoshi writes, MySQL router, all this stuff will not work with MariaDB server. This only works with MySQL and Percona server. The external ecosystem is alive and kicking, right? So many good things. You've got Toolkit, Extra Backup, Proxy SQL, MaxScale. What else? Vitess, I think we have a talk for Vitess later. Orchestrator, definitely Shlomi will probably talk about it later. Sandbox, now in a new language even. So lots of people actually pay attention to making tools around MySQL, and I think that's why you should use it, right? Because it's very vibrant, it's a great ecosystem. When do you want to use MariaDB server today? So everything's about today, right? So I'm not talking about the betas or the release candidates. A whole bunch of reasons why you'd probably want to use MariaDB today that you may choose over say MySQL or Percona server. Also a whole bunch of reasons why you'd want to use Percona server over say MySQL. So maybe you want to use MyRox, which is fully generally available. You want to use the Keyring Vault plugin for encryption. You want column compression maybe. You've outgrown MySQL for some reason. Percona server, great choice. And for everyone else, I think the best is actually for you to use MySQL 5.7. It's been out for 2 years. It's pretty stable. It's well worth using. There is obviously the very near future, which I estimate to be less than 3 months. MySQL 8 also brings you things like roles, common table expressions, window functions, histograms. MariaDB Server 10.3 brings you Oracle support as well to some extent. System version tables I think is extremely cool because it's coming out of the SQL, I think 2011 standard possibly. You also got the semi-sync stuff merged in via Alibaba. SQL mode equals Oracle I think could be a game changer for people who are migrating from Oracle to another open source database. So what should you use today? I think you should care about the innovation today, and most of the innovation I spoke about has already happened for at least 2 years. So both 5.7 and 10.1 has been around for about that long. Think about the features you need today. You definitely want freedom from vendor independence. You want to always make sure that there are multiple support vendors supporting your product. Know the difference between a branch and a fork. And some might recognize this. Michael Stonebreaker said that for Facebook, MySQL would be a fate worse than death. So they made T-shirts. I think mastering the ecosystem takes a lot of time, which is something that you should invest in if you care about MySQL, and it's definitely not a fate worse than death for anybody. So, let's stop with the FOD and let's focus on good stuff and making sure we're a strong ecosystem where people look at us as a first choice as opposed to saying, hey, let's try Postgres or MongoDB. Thank you for listening. And I have some time for questions. Yes.